Pilots and passengers on a Jet Airways flight from Qatar to India are now fighting to survive due to bad weather and a faulty ILS system. It's nearly impossible for the pilots to see the runway. Not once, not twice, but they've tried takeoff 6 times. They've been circling the airport for 2 hours already, and now they're almost out of fuel. There's only about 10 minutes of flying left, and they're flying really low in zero visibility conditions, with GPW warnings starting to go off. If they can't land this plane at the airport in the next 10 minutes, there's a chance they crash in the city of Tiruvananthapuram. The question is, how did things get so bad? This is the real story behind the Bollywood movie Runway 34. This is how one wrong decision by a single person put the lives of 150 people at risk. This is the story of Jet Airways. Flight 555 was a Boeing 737-800 operated by Jet Airways, getting ready for a 4-hour flight from Hamad International Airport in Qatar to Kochi International Airport in Kerala, South India, on August 17, 2015. The pilots flying that day had only flown this plane from Chennai to Doha the day before. She has more than 24 hours to rest between flights. The Doha to Kochi route is one of the most popular flight paths, and this plane was carrying passengers with a crew of 8. The plane used today is a Boeing 737-800, the most commonly used narrow-body aircraft in the world, powered by 2 CFM56 turbofan engines that burn about 500 kilograms of fuel every 10 minutes. The total flight time is 4 hours, and it's flown by 2 pilots. The first officer was flying the plane while the captain, who is 40 years old and has nearly 6,700 hours of experience, and the first officer on this plane is only 25 years old with just 1,500 hours of flight time. Because of the big difference in age and experience, this power dynamic will soon become a problem in the story's local timing. According to the flight plan, the plane was supposed to take off at 10:30 p.m. Before departure, when they got the weather report for Kochi, they found out it was made 10 hours earlier. That's why they didn't have the latest update on Kochi's weather. So they had to base their entire plan on that outdated report. There were light crosswinds at 5 knots in Kochi with scattered clouds and visibility up to 4,000 meters. The alternate airports they considered were Tiruvananthapuram and Kozhikode, both in Kerala near the Western Ghats, so their weather conditions were pretty similar. When the pilot had to pick an alternate airport, he chose Bengaluru because the weather and flight safety there were better than in Tiruvananthapuram, making it a safer choice. Visibility in Bengaluru was at 8,000 meters, with scattered clouds at 1,200 feet and broken clouds at 8,000 feet. Coimbatore was chosen as the second alternate airport. Before takeoff, the question was, how much fuel do they need? There are lots of other rules about how much fuel a plane has to have before it can take off. At 19:20 Universal Time Coordinated, the plane was turned back, and at 19:37 Universal Time Coordinated, it left Doha heading to India. The whole trip took 4 hours. After finishing the 1.5-hour flight, they got close to the west coast of India and contacted air traffic control at 4:30 a.m. They reported visibility in Kochi was 3,500 meters, with some clouds at around 15 feet, and it was overcast. It was cloudy and scattered at 8,000 feet as they continued approaching Kochi Airport, which has a single runway numbered 09/27. The plane arrived at Kochi Airport at 5:02 a.m. and was cleared by ATC to approach runway 27. Since by that time, there were 4,845 kilograms of fuel left on board. This would be their first landing attempt of the day. When ATC gave the pilot the updated weather info, they said visibility had dropped to 3,000 meters and there was fog covering the entire runway area. The plane entered a cloud layer and the captain's forward visibility dropped due to clouds. He couldn't see anything outside. The minimum visibility for this runway was 650 meters, and the decision height was 320 feet in case they couldn't see the runway. They had to circle around hoping to spot it. They extended their flaps and lowered the gear while descending on the Clyde slope, but the weather kept getting worse as they dropped below 1,000 feet. So they couldn't see anything and reached the decision altitude without the runway in sight. At 256 feet, they pulled the go-around button, applied full power, and made their first go-around at 5 a.m. Indian Standard Time. The plane took off again, followed the misapproach procedure, and tried to land once more. At this point, there were 4,699 kilograms of fuel left on board, enough to divert the plane to Bangalore, which requires at least 3,306 kilograms of fuel. The alternate airports were Bangalore and Coimbatore, but they didn't want to land at either of those after some time. The crew asked ATC for the weather in Tiruvananthapuram, but the question is, since they could land in Tiruvananthapuram, why do they want to land there when it's also near the Western Ghats? The weather there was similar to Cochin airports. Actually, if they decided to head to Tiruvananthapuram instead of Bengaluru, they'd get a chance to hold 20 more minutes of matches, and they'd probably be able to make 2 extra landing attempts at Cochin Airport. Since Tiruvananthapuram wasn't originally in their plans, the first officer checked the airport's name. According to the info, ILS at Tiruvananthapuram Airport was closed for maintenance. The crew needed good visibility to land there, and it was reported that visibility in Tiruvananthapuram was 3,000 meters with clouds at 1,500 feet, which was above the minimum height for a four-approach. So, the captain was confident he could do it. The plane landed in Tiruvananthapuram when 2 Air India Express planes were approaching Kochi Airport for their final approach. The second plane tried to land, but because of poor visibility, it couldn't. Since the first Air India Express plane managed to land, the Jet Airways pilots also thought about landing. Once the Air India Express plane touched down, the Jet Airways crew decided to give it another shot, but they still couldn't see the runway. So at 5:47 a.m. local time, they did another go-around and went back into a holding pattern. The fuel on board had dropped to 3,919 kilograms during the third attempt to land in Kochi. To do this, they'd have to burn about 800 kilograms of fuel. If they didn't divert the plane to Bangalore at that point, after a while there wouldn't be enough fuel left to reach Bangalore soon. But remember, the captain wanted to land in Tiruvananthapuram to buy some extra time to book in Kochi. The captain discussed this plan with the first officer, but the first officer was worried because the ILS system wasn't available in Tiruvananthapuram. The weather in Tiruvananthapuram was bad. It wasn't great, and there was worry that visibility might get worse because of the hedges and sunrise. The captain told the first officer that if the weather in Tiruvananthapuram got worse, they could divert to Coimbatore as an alternative. They were close to Cochin Airport, but interestingly, they never checked the weather in Coimbatore. Remember, the power settings in the cockpit I mentioned earlier started to become important here. Then the crew informed ATC that they were considering their options as they headed toward Tiruvananthapuram Airport, right around the same time a Kuwaiti plane was They had to go around because they couldn't see the runway. Based on updated info from the Kuwait plane, air traffic control told the crew that visibility was now down to 1,500 meters, with low clouds at 400 feet, and the weather had gotten worse. ATC then asked 4 separate Jet Airways crews to explain their plans. The captain told ATC he planned to try landing in Cochin again, but if that didn't work, they would head straight to Tiruvananthapuram. By this time, the weather had become really bad, but they tried to land again, but failed once more. As time went by, they reached an altitude of 4,000 feet, and now there were only 245 kilograms of fuel left on the plane. The minimum fuel required to get to Bangalore was 3,306 kilograms, which meant there wasn't enough fuel left to turn back. Because of this, they had to head to Tiruvananthapuram Airport. After reaching Tiruvananthapuram, they'd only have about 30 kilograms of extra fuel left, which would let them fly for just 1 more minute. That means they had to land at Tiruvananthapuram Airport as soon as possible. 5 minutes later, the Tiruvananthapuram Air Traffic Control Center informed the Kochi Air Traffic Control Center that visibility at Tiruvananthapuram had dropped to 1,500 meters and asked them to pass this info on to the Jet Airways plane. But they couldn't get that message to the plane, which was heading to Tiruvananthapuram, unaware that conditions there had worsened. The weather at Tiruvananthapuram wasn't any different from the weather at Kochi, the airport right in the city. Over the Arabian Sea, like many airports in Kerala, Tiruvananthapuram also has just one runway. When the plane approached Tiruvananthapuram Airport at 6:30 a.m. local time, the crew immediately contacted the Air Traffic Control Center there and gave them the chance to check the current weather data. The visibility at the airport was around 1,500 meters. ATC asked them to head towards runway 14, but even at this airport, the weather wasn't great for landing. Still, they had to get the plane down as soon as possible, as the plane was about 25 nautical miles from Tiruvananthapuram Airport. The pilot realized they were flying way too high. If they didn't drop altitude ASAP, the plane wouldn't be able to land there. So the pilot decided to do a full 360-degree turn to lose height quickly. Because of that turn, the plane was left with barely any fuel. If they didn't land soon, they'd run out of fuel mid-air. Then ATC cleared them to land on runway 14 with 2,000 meters visibility. At 6:05 a.m. local time, the plane reached the minimum decision altitude. But again, they couldn't see the runway because the plane was low on fuel. The final reserve fuel was 1,324 kilograms, and the minimum final reserve is 1,300 kilograms. If the plane drops below that, the crew has to declare an emergency. In an emergency, the plane can land at any airport. All types of approaches open up after 2 minutes when the fuel level drops below 1,300 kilograms. Then, the first officer makes an emergency call to ATC. For a visual approach, you need to see the runway and the approach path clearly. The captain he had just made an instrument approach a while ago, but still couldn't see the runway, and now he wanted to try another instrument approach again, even though visibility was 0. The captain wanted to do a visual approach, because with a visual approach, you can take a much tighter path to cut down landing time, since this was an emergency flight. So, ATC cleared them for a visual approach to runway 14. The crew turned the plane to the right and leveled off at 1,000 feet, which is way lower than usual. They continued the descent and adjusted the plane's path toward the airport. However, during this approach, the crew never actually had the runway in sight. As they reached the final approach, the captain said the descent was way too high, which caused the landing to fail again. Now, there was only 898 kilograms of fuel left on the plane, so they requested another visual approach to runway 14. ATC told the crew that visibility was still the same, and with only 15 minutes of fuel left, they had to try landing again. This time, the crew tried descending to 1,000 feet, then after a while down to 500 feet, still keeping the runway in sight. But their altitude was way too low, so the captain took control and sharply banked the plane to the left of the point that day. They got a warning to make a sixth landing attempt by turning at the bank angle. There were only 662 kilograms of fuel left on the plane, with about 10 minutes of flight time remaining. The captain climbed the plane to 700 feet, now heading toward the opposite runway. They wanted to land on runway 32. This was their last shot at landing, because if they couldn't land this time, the plane would run out of fuel. They were flying over the center of the capital city of Kerala. If the plane ran out of fuel, it would crash in a densely populated area. But the plane was still inside the clouds, and they couldn't see a thing. He closed his eyes and started. As they were descending toward the ground, the terrain proximity radar gave a warning. It seemed low enough for the captain to actually see houses and people below. But forward visibility was still poor, and the runway was nowhere in sight. They switched to autopilot. As they got closer to the runway, they spotted a faint outline to their left. Again, they were just about 50 feet above the runway, which was now visible. Eventually, they managed to line up pretty well with the center line. At 7:01 a.m., the captain pushed the nose of the plane down, and they finally touched down on runway 32. After landing, the plane had only 300 kilograms of fuel left, enough to fly for another 5 minutes. They then stopped the plane and parked it at the gate. After a few hours, the weather cleared up, the plane was refueled, passengers boarded again, and the same crew headed back to Cochin. The final report blamed the airline's lack of a clear policy on how many landing attempts the crew could make at the main or alternate airport. This meant the crew didn't consider switching to another airport during bad weather. The report also mentioned that pilot training, it should include activities about low fuel and making decisions in bad weather. If you like this video,